I need you to cover my debt before Grandma finds out. My cousin begged me in the garage, but I had already paid the collector to send me copies, so I said, I already know who used her name. Then I opened the file that showed his last 3 withdrawals. The whole thing started with a phone call that should have been routine and ended up blowing up my family in a way I still think about sometimes. I live in the small house my grandmother owns, the one behind her main place, because after my grandfather died, I helped her with bills, repairs, groceries, and whatever else she needed. It was supposed to be temporary. That was 6 years ago. My grandmother, Ruth, is the kind of woman who still keeps receipts in little rubber-banded stacks and writes the date on every envelope she saves. She is not dramatic. She is not careless. She is not the kind of person who forgets to pay a debt. And she is definitely not the kind of person who suddenly owes some collection agency money she has never heard of. So when the first letter came, I thought it was a scam. Then the second one came, certified, with her full name on it. Then the phone started ringing, not just once, repeatedly, at odd hours. The same company kept asking for her, and the callers always had that bored, hard voice people use when they make a living turning somebody else's panic into a payment plan. My grandmother almost never answered the phone herself anymore because the constant spam had worn her down. So I started screening calls for her. The debt was real. That part became obvious quickly. What was not obvious was why it was in her name. I sat down at her kitchen table with the letters spread out in front of me and read the account number over and over until it stopped looking like random numbers and started looking like a problem. It was a personal debt account, not a medical bill, not a utility. A loan. My grandmother had never taken out a loan without telling me, and she would have told me because she asked me to handle every financial thing that confused her. She trusted me because I was the one who filled out forms with her, balanced her checkbook, and knew where she kept her important papers. My cousin Kevin did not live with us, but he came around a lot. Too much, if I was being honest. He had been having a rough stretch for about a year, which in my family meant everyone was supposed to lower their expectations and open their wallets. He was 30 at the time, always between jobs, always one payment away from fixing everything, always with some explanation that made the problem sound temporary if you did not think too hard about it. He had borrowed my grandmother's SUV for grocery runs. He had used her mower. He had used her garage freezer space for a batch of meat. He swore he was buying wholesale. He had even started bringing her oranges and extra toilet paper like he was doing the family a favor. I should have paid more attention. That part still annoys me. I knew he was in bad shape financially. I just did not know how bad. The first letter from the collector had a generic name and a threatening tone that was probably legal enough to make a nervous older woman feel cornered. I checked the account number against the bank records I had access to because my grandmother had added me as someone allowed to help with statements years ago after one of her surgery recoveries. The account did not belong to any institution I recognized. That made me curious. Curiosity turned into suspicion when I noticed the address tied to the debt was not my grandmother's main house. It was the garage apartment, the little room Kevin had been sleeping in on and off whenever his rent situation went sideways. My stomach dropped when I saw that. I remember standing in the kitchen with the letter in my hand and looking out toward the garage like it had changed shape. The apartment was technically separate, but the postal carrier had been lazy about mail ever since the old mailbox on the side fence got bent in a storm. We had all been getting each other's mail for years. That meant anyone with enough access could have had enough time to do something stupid. I did not accuse him that day. I just started collecting facts. I called the collector back after my grandmother went to bed. I kept the calls short and calm. I paid their document fee when they said they could mail me copies of the account records because at that point I wanted the paper trail more than I wanted a debate. That was the first smart move I made. The second smart move was checking the bank statements line by line. The account had not just been opened. It had activity, a deposit, a cash withdrawal, another cash withdrawal, then a third. All 3 were recent. All 3 were small enough to look ordinary if you were skimming, and all 3 were big enough to hurt an elderly woman on a fixed income. The withdrawals were done at an ATM not far from Kevin's apartment. That alone would not have proved anything. Life is messy. People use nearby atoms all the time, but I kept reading. The collector packet arrived 3 days later in a plain envelope with enough printed pages to make me understand why they charged the fee. It included the application. It included call notes, it included payment history, and it included the last several transactions that had triggered the collection action. The name on the application was my grandmother's, the phone number was her landline, the address was the garage apartment. The employer field had been filled with a place Kevin had worked at for about 4 months before getting let go. I sat there with the pages in my lap and just stared. That was when the first real version of the truth started forming, Not all at once, piece by piece, bad enough that my grandmother's name had been used. Worse that whoever did it had access to her address, her phone, and some of her identity details. Worst of all, the timing of the cash withdrawals lined up with the exact dates Kevin had been hanging around the house acting like he was helping her. I still did not want to believe it. That is the honest truth. I wanted the problem to be a mistake, a clerk error, a stolen purse, some dumb family accident that could be fixed without turning into a war. That is why I did not storm over to Kevin immediately. I kept reading. I made copies. I called the bank and asked for old statements going back further. I asked for transaction notes. I asked for the dates and times on the ATM withdrawals. I asked for the branch manager by name when I went in person. I wrote everything down in a yellow legal pad because I did not trust my memory once my nerves got going. The banker looked at me like I was being overly serious until he saw how organized I was. Then he started taking me seriously. He could not tell me much without a formal fraud complaint, but he could tell me the withdrawals had been done with a physical card and a PIN. That mattered. That meant this was not just identity theft from some random website. It was someone who had access to her card or her account details. Maybe both. I asked him to note the account for suspicious activity. Then I came home and found Kevin in the garage pretending to be busy with a broken lawn trimmer. He looked sweaty and off in that way people do when they have already been thinking about the exact thing you are now about to mention. He tried to act normal. I know now that the signs were all there in his face. At the time, I mostly just felt tired. He asked whether I had any cash to help him out. Not a huge amount. Just enough to get him over a rough patch until his next paycheck. He said his truck was having problems. His landlord was being unreasonable, and one of his cards had been frozen. He said it all with the same exhausted tone, like the world was just cruel to him for no reason. I did not answer right away. I remember looking at the garage shelves and the old Christmas decorations and the stacked paint cans and thinking that this was a ridiculous place to have the conversation that was about to happen. Then I asked him which debt collector had been calling Grandma. He went still, not dramatically, just enough that I saw the color leave his face. He asked how much I had heard. I asked him why a debt in Grandma's name had the garage apartment address on it. He started talking fast after that. Too fast. He said it was a misunderstanding. He said he had only used her information because he needed a short-term option. He said he was going to pay it back before she ever found out. He said he panicked. That part, weirdly, was believable. The panic, not the rest. He was trying to frame it like he had done a stupid adult thing that got a little out of hand, not like he had taken an old woman's identity and used it to create a debt nobody had authorized. Then he asked me to cover it. That is the part that still makes me angry when I remember it. He did not ask for help in the abstract. He asked me to pay it before Grandma found out. He said she would be humiliated. He said she would not understand the difference between a bad decision and theft. He said family was supposed to protect family. He said all of this standing in a garage next to a mower he had not fixed in 3 weeks. I had already spent enough time with the paperwork by then to know he was not telling me the full story, so I asked him if he knew about the 3 withdrawals. His expression changed again. That was the moment I knew I had hit something real. I did not raise my voice. I did not threaten him. I just went back to the kitchen, got the file I had made, and came back holding it. He followed me halfway like a nervous dog. The file was nothing fancy, just a cheap accordion folder with printed statements, collector pages, and notes from the bank. I opened it on the workbench. The top page showed the account summary. The next pages showed the transaction history. Then there it was, 3 cash withdrawals, one on a Friday night, one on a Saturday morning, one 2 days later after the deposit from Grandma's pension cleared. The amounts were not huge in the way people on television think about fraud. They were small enough to hide. That was what made them disgusting. The first one was for $300. The second was for $400. The third was for $500. They had all been taken from the same ATM less than 2 miles from Kevin's apartment. I watched him read the printout. He did not deny it right away. He stared at the page with that same dull panic people get when the world stops cooperating with the story they have been telling themselves. Then he said he had meant to replace the money. Then he said he had only borrowed it. Then he said Grandma had not needed it right then. Then he said I was making it bigger than it was. I remember feeling something in my chest go flat, not rage, just a very cold disappointment. I told him I already knew who used her name. I said it slowly enough that he understood I was not guessing. He asked who told me. I told him nobody had told me. I told him the collector did not even need to say much because the documents did the talking for me. That was when he started sweating harder. He asked whether I had called the bank. I said yes. He asked whether Grandma knew. I said no, not yet. Then he asked me again to cover the debt, and that was when I realized he was not sorry for what he had done. He was sorry it had stopped working. That is a very different kind of sorry. I had seen it before in other people, usually in small doses, usually in coworkers trying to dodge blame. I had not expected to see it in my own family. I told him I was not paying anything. He tried the guilt route after that. He said Grandma would have a heart attack if she found out. He said I would be the one tearing the family apart if I exposed him. He said he was under pressure and had not had a real break in months. He said he had been helping around the house more than anyone noticed. All true enough to sound plausible. None of it changed the facts. I took the file back inside and locked it in my desk. Then I spent the rest of the evening pretending everything was normal. That was hard. I made my grandmother tea. I checked the deadbolt. I answered one more call from the collector and told them not to contact her directly again because I was handling a fraud dispute. That phrase made them perk up. Fraud dispute sounds expensive. It also sounds like paperwork, which is usually enough to make a collector slow down and route things differently. The next morning, I called my cousin's mother, Marla, because she was the only person in the family who had enough influence over Kevin to make him sit still long enough to listen. Marla is the kind of woman who can make every problem sound like a tragic inconvenience. She also has a habit of defending her son first and asking for the truth later. When I told her the basics, she said I had to be misunderstanding the account, because Kevin would never do something like that to Grandma. That was almost funny, almost. I told her I had the documents. That got her quiet. Then she asked whether I was accusing him of theft or just bad judgment. I told her the two were not separate in this case. She did not like that answer. I think she hated it because it made the situation impossible to smooth over. She said she would talk to him. I said that was fine, but I was also filing the fraud report in the morning. That is where the family split started. Not in a loud way, in a normal way, in the kind of way that looks small at first and then becomes the shape of your life. Marla called back twice before noon. Kevin called once and let it ring. Then he texted me a string of panicked messages that I did not answer because I did not want a text argument about felony-level stupidity. By then, I had already gone to the bank again. This time, I brought Grandma with me. I did not tell her everything on the drive over. I told her there was suspicious activity, and I wanted to make sure her accounts were safe. She was annoyed at first because she had a hair appointment and hated doing errands in the middle of the day. That annoyance vanished the moment the banker explained the account had been opened with her name but a different address and then used for cash withdrawals. I still remember her sitting there with her handbag in her lap, silent, staring at the desk, while the banker walked her through the fraud affidavit. She did not cry. That was the strange part. I expected tears. Instead, she got very still and asked for each page to be repeated more slowly. She wanted dates. She wanted transaction times. She wanted to know whether the withdrawals had happened when she was at home or at the hospital after her knee flare-up. That is when the timing hit me hardest. The first withdrawal happened the same night she had been in bed with a fever and Kevin had offered to pick up soup. The second happened the morning after he had driven her to her doctor appointment. The third happened while she was at church with me and had left her purse on the passenger seat of his borrowed truck because she trusted him. That last part was what made her expression change. It was not just anger, it was recognition. She understood all at once that somebody had been using the moments when she was vulnerable. That is the kind of thing that changes a person. She still loved Kevin after that. That did not disappear. But love got mixed with something colder. She asked whether I was sure. I showed her the statements. I showed her the collector packet. She looked at the address on the application and laughed once in this tiny disbelieving way that did not sound like amusement at all. Then she asked me to take her home because she needed to sit down. I took her home. I waited while she put on her reading glasses and went through the file again at her kitchen table. Then she called Marla herself. I did not hear the whole conversation because I stepped outside to give her privacy. I only saw enough to know it was not going well. Marla came over that afternoon with Kevin in tow, both of them angry in the tight, defensive way people get when they know they are about to be cornered by facts. I had set the file on the dining room table. I had the printed bank statements clipped together. I had the collector packet in the center like a bad little altar of accountability. Nobody shouted right away. That part surprised me. Marla immediately started with damage control. She said Kevin had made a temporary mistake. She said he had used the address because he was staying near Grandma. She said it must have been some kind of misunderstanding at the loan office. Kevin stood beside her with his arms crossed and looked at the carpet. He did not meet Grandma's eyes. That was when I knew she understood more than he wanted her to. Grandma asked him directly, in the calm voice she uses when she is most dangerous, whether he had taken money from her account. He denied it at first, not strongly, just enough to leave himself room. Then I opened the section of the file that showed the ATM locations and times. I had marked them with little tabs. I had also written the dates on a notepad next to them. The first withdrawal was made at 11:47 p.m., the second at 8:12 a.m., the 3rd at 1:03 p.m. Those times mattered because they matched specific moments when Kevin had told us he was elsewhere. He had told Grandma he was working late. He had told Marla he was at a friend's place. He had told me he was helping with a tire issue. None of that lined up. Then I pulled out the banknote that confirmed the card had been physically used at the ATM with the correct PIN. Marla's face changed when she saw that. Kevin looked trapped. He finally admitted he had used the card. He tried to soften it. He said he had only borrowed it once. The file made that impossible. 3 withdrawals are not once. 3 withdrawals are a pattern. Grandma asked him whether he had opened the debt account too. He tried to say no again. I showed her the application, her name, her address, her phone. Her signature line was not fully filled in, which honestly made it worse because it meant he had been sloppy. Grandma saw the same thing I did. She was not fooled by the messiness. She was offended by it. It is one thing to betray someone and do it cleanly. It is another thing to betray them badly and expect to be forgiven because you were inept. That afternoon turned into the ugliest family meeting I have ever sat through. Nobody admitted to being the villain. Marla kept saying Kevin had been under pressure. Kevin kept saying he had intended to pay it back. Grandma kept asking why he did not come to her first. That was the one question nobody had a good answer for. The truth was simple enough that it made everyone uncomfortable. He had not come to her because he knew she would say no. He had not come to me because he knew I would ask questions, so he had taken what was easy and hoped the consequences would arrive after he had fixed his life. That is not how debt works. That is not how fraud works either. Once the truth was sitting on the table, there was no way to make it small again. Grandma told Kevin to leave, not forever, just that day. The words came out steady. That steadiness hit harder than yelling would have. Marla tried to argue that they should all calm down. Grandma told her she was calm. That ended the debate. Kevin left looking like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him. Marla stayed long enough to say she did not believe he was some criminal and that this was all a terrible spiral. I did not disagree with the spiral part. I just no longer cared whether he thought of himself as a criminal. The result was the same. That night, I filed the fraud report. I also opened a police report because the bank asked me to and because the collector packet was not going to magically disappear just because we all had feelings about it. That was the least dramatic part of the whole process. There was no movie-style siren moment. Just forms, copies, reference numbers. A detective who had clearly seen worse and still took notes very carefully because he knew older fraud cases often get hand-waved until someone insists on documentation. He asked the same questions a dozen different ways. Who had access to the purse? Who lived in the garage apartment? Who had used the ATM near the gas station? Who had picked up the mail? Who had ever helped Grandma set the PIN? That last question was the most annoying, because yes, I had, so had Kevin. That made me feel stupid for about 20 minutes. Then the detective pointed out the withdrawals had happened during time windows when Kevin was the only person with her card. That helped. A lot. The bank froze the account while they investigated. They opened a new one 2 days later. Grandma had to sign a pile of forms and spend an hour on hold with the fraud department. I sat next to her through all of it. I also sat through the part where they asked about the debt account and whether she had ever authorized it. She answered no without hesitation. That mattered. A lot of people assume the older person at the center of a fraud case will be confused or embarrassed or unable to follow what is happening. Grandma was offended, not confused. That made her much harder to manipulate. She called Kevin the next morning. She did not put the call on speaker, but she came out of her room after and told me enough to know he had cried. That was not the part that moved her. The part that moved her was that he never once gave a clean answer about why he had taken the cash withdrawals. He kept circling around it. Rent, car repairs, pressure, desperation. All the things people say when they want circumstances to be the villain. She told me she did not care how desperate he was. She cared that he had lied to her while taking money from her. That was the line, not the debt itself. The lying, that line changed how she looked at the whole family. Marla came back later that week, this time without Kevin, and she spent an hour talking in circles about how nobody was perfect and how this would ruin his future if we pushed it too far. I was polite. I really was. I told her the future was already doing fine on its own until he used Grandma's name. I also told her I was not interested in destroying him. I was interested in making sure Grandma was not left paying for his choices. That distinction mattered. A lot of people in my family like to confuse accountability with vengeance. They are not the same thing. The bank finished its initial review and confirmed the account qualified for fraud handling. That meant the debt was no longer sitting on Grandma as if she had somehow chosen it. It also meant the collector had to back off while the dispute moved forward. I saved every letter, every email, every voicemail, every note. I had become, by necessity, the kind of person who keeps a file on people who thought they could bluff their way through a paper trail. The detective eventually got the ATM footage from the gas station. That took longer than I expected because businesses are not exactly eager to hand over old recordings unless a report number gives them a reason. When he called me back, he did not sound surprised. He said the footage showed Kevin at the machine during one of the withdrawal times. He was wearing the same jacket he had worn that evening at Grandma's house. It was not a dramatic reveal. It was just another ugly fact placed on top of the pile. Kevin's version of events got smaller after that. He stopped denying the withdrawals. He started admitting to the debt account. He still tried to frame it as temporary theft with good intentions, which is one of the most insulting categories of excuse because it wants praise for not being worse. I did not talk to him much during that period. Neither did Grandma. Marla tried to keep the peace by making excuses to the rest of the family, but the story was already moving on its own. Once the bank and police were involved, people stopped hearing her and started hearing the words fraud, identity use, unauthorized withdrawal, and pending review. Those words do something to family politics. They strip away the easy sentiment. Suddenly, everybody cares less about what is polite and more about what is provable. That was the one advantage we had. Proof: I had the collector packet. I had the bank statements. I had timestamps. I had the ATM footage through the detective. I had Grandma's signed fraud affidavit. Kevin had feelings. That was not enough. The first real consequence came when the bank sent Grandma a provisional credit and closed the compromised account. She was relieved, but also embarrassed that she had to switch things around at her age. I helped her set up the new account. I changed all her automatic payments. I wrote down every login, password, and reminder in a notebook she keeps in the bread box. Then I drove her to the post office so she could file a change of address form for the mail that had been going through the garage apartment. That small errand was the one that made her stop and finally say she felt foolish. She said she should have noticed earlier. I told her that Kevin had counted on her not noticing. That was not the same thing. She nodded, but I could tell she still felt embarrassed. That is one of the worst parts of being betrayed by family. You end up carrying shame that belongs to the person who did it. Kevin lost access to the house after that. Not in a dramatic lockout scene. Grandma simply changed the garage code and told him he needed to ask before coming by. She also made me sort through the shared mail area and remove anything tied to her accounts. There were more little discoveries in there than I expected. A rebate card that had been used, a notice from a store card she had never opened, a forwarding slip in Kevin's handwriting, nothing huge by itself. All of it together painted a much uglier picture. He had not just made one bad choice. He had treated the house like a convenient source of money and information. That realization made me feel sick. I had let him carry groceries in and out of that kitchen. I had let him sit at Grandma's table. I had let him borrow tools. I had assumed the worst he was capable of was being irresponsible. That was my mistake. I own that. A few weeks later, the detective called again and asked whether Grandma was willing to sign off on charges if the prosecutor moved forward. She was quiet for a long time after that question. I think she had still been hoping for some version of this where Kevin would just pay everything back and it would become one of those ugly family stories nobody likes to repeat. But the system had already moved. The bank had already documented it. The footage had already been logged. The collection account had already been linked to her identity. At that point, the choice was not really between peace and conflict. It was between truth and pretending. She signed. I do not think she enjoyed that decision. I know she did not, but she also did not back down. That was the part that made me proud of her. My aunt tried one last time to make me feel guilty about it. She called and said I was helping destroy her son. I told her I had spent the last month helping keep her mother from paying for his debt. She said he had been desperate. I told her desperation does not put your grandmother's name on a loan application. That ended the call. For a while after that, family gatherings got awkward in the way only real family damage can make them. People still showed up to birthdays and holidays, but everyone knew the subject that could not be mentioned. Kevin stopped coming around unless Grandma explicitly said he could. When he did come by, he looked smaller somehow. Less cocky. More careful. That did not earn him forgiveness. It just made the room quieter. The collector eventually sent a corrected letter confirming the account was under dispute, and then later that it had been referred for fraud review. I kept that letter too. By then my file drawer was looking ridiculous. I had folders for every bank form, every account note, every call log, every letter from the collector, every police reference number, and every copy of the ATM footage summary the detective was allowed to share. I was not doing it out of spite. I was doing it because once a family lie gets enough oxygen, it starts becoming the official version of events. I was not going to let that happen. About 2 months in, the bank finalized its decision and removed Grandma's liability from the debt account. That was the cleanest moment in the whole mess. No dramatic thunderclap. Just a letter saying the account had been investigated, the dispute was validated, and she would not be held responsible for the balance. I brought the letter into the kitchen and laid it down in front of her. She read it twice. Then she leaned back and let out this long breath I did not realize she had been holding for weeks. She still looked hurt. She still looked tired. But the fear of being trapped by somebody else's debt was gone. That mattered more than anything else. Kevin, meanwhile, was dealing with the consequences in the only way people like him ever do. He kept trying to negotiate the size of the damage instead of confronting the fact that he caused it. He talked about repayment schedules. He talked about borrowing from friends. He talked about part-time work and selling his truck. He talked like somebody who still believed the system would reward him for sounding responsible after the fact. It did not. His truck got sold. Not because I wanted that, because he had used it as collateral for another short-term loan I had not even known about until the paperwork surfaced. That one shocked me. It also explained where some of the missing cash had gone. He had been chasing debts with more debts. Classic spiral, bad enough on its own. Worse because he dragged Grandma into the middle of it. When the lender started calling him directly, he came around one evening looking hollowed out. He asked if there was any chance I could help keep Grandma from pressing charges. I told him that was not my decision. He asked if I would testify on his behalf if it went that far. I said I would tell the truth. That was the end of his hope for a soft landing, not because I was cruel, because the truth was a much harder surface than he had expected. By then the family had split into two camps, people who wanted to minimize everything and people who had seen the documents and could not unsee them. Most of the older relatives eventually drifted toward Grandma's side because they understood what it meant to have your identity used against you. The younger ones mostly avoided the topic entirely. That is what families do when the story gets embarrassing enough. They pretend time will sand off the edges. Sometimes it does. Not this time. A month after the bank closed the case, Grandma asked me to go with her to her attorney. She wanted to review her will and power of attorney documents. She was not angry when she said it, just practical. She told me Kevin was no longer to have access to her financial records, and she wanted everything updated properly. That was a weird afternoon, not because of the paperwork, because I could tell how much it cost her to say it out loud. She was not punishing him, she was protecting herself. There is a difference. The attorney walked us through everything. Updated beneficiaries, restricted access, health care proxy clarification. No more shared keys floating around with the assumption that family meant trust. I sat there while she signed each page and realized the mess had changed her in a permanent way. Not in a bitter way, in a careful way. She asked better questions after that. She checked statements more often. She kept her important folder locked. She stopped handing out her card for errands. That was a sad change, but a necessary one. Kevin eventually got offered a plea deal. Not jail time. At least not right away. Restitution, probation, mandatory financial counseling, community service. The kind of legal outcome that does not feel dramatic but still lands hard because it touches every part of somebody's life. He took it because he did not really have a better option. Marla called me furious when it happened. She said I had gone too far. I told her the prosecutor made the deal, not me. She said I had pushed for charges. I told her I had pushed for truth. That was enough for her to stop speaking to me for a while. Honestly, I did not mind the silence as much as I expected. The entire situation had taught me how much emotional labor gets dumped on the person who refuses to lie. That gets old fast. Grandma and I settled into a quieter routine after everything calmed down. The house felt different. Safer, mostly. Less like anyone could walk in and help themselves to whatever they wanted. I changed the locks on the side gate. I installed a small camera on the front porch, partly because of Kevin, and partly because after being through one fraud case, you stop wanting surprises. Grandma pretended not to like the camera. Then she asked me to show her how to check the footage on her tablet. That was probably the most normal thing we did all summer. The oddest part was how often she apologized to me, not for the fraud itself, for the inconvenience, for the stress, for making me spend nights in folders and statements instead of doing something more pleasant with my time. I told her I would do it again. That was true. She raised me in more ways than one, and I was not about to let a cousin steal her peace because he was too ashamed to confess before he got caught. A few months later, the detective called to say the bank footage, the ATM footage, the account application, and Kevin's own admissions were enough to move the case forward cleanly. I did not celebrate. I just wrote the date down. That habit turned out to be useful more often than I ever imagined. At the final family gathering before Thanksgiving, Kevin did not come. Marla did. She looked exhausted and older than I remembered. She did not ask for a truce. I think she knew better by then. She mostly sat with Grandma and talked about ordinary things, which was probably the closest either of them could get to peace. There was no big emotional reconciliation, no movie moment where everybody hugged and admitted mistakes. Real life is usually less neat than that. Grandma did eventually thank me in a way that mattered. She said I had not let them make her feel stupid for what happened. That hit harder than anything else because that was exactly what I had been trying to do. Not rescue her, not fight her battles for her. Just keep the facts in front of her until the facts won. That is the thing I think people miss when they hear stories like this. The hardest part is not the confrontation. It is the weeks before it. The weird feeling that something is wrong but you do not have enough proof yet. The temptation to ask for explanations, because explanations are easier than evidence. The little voice that says maybe you are overreacting. I had that voice the whole time. I just did not let it run the house. If I had, Grandma would have been stuck with a debt that was not hers, and Kevin would have kept lying until somebody less patient than me found out the hard way. Instead, I paid the collector for the copies. I kept every page. I wrote down every date. I asked for the ATM times. I checked the addresses. I did the boring work. That boring work is what exposed him. That is why the garage conversation ended the way it did. He thought he was cornering me. He thought he was asking for a favor before Grandma found out. He did not know I already had the file. He did not know I had traced the withdrawals. He did not know the collector had already mailed me the account copies because I had asked for them first. So when he begged me to cover his debt, I was not guessing. I was done guessing. I had already seen the last 3 withdrawals. I had already matched the times. I had already put together the pattern. And once the pattern was visible, the lie could not survive it. That is probably the only reason this story ended as well as it did. Not because anyone in my family suddenly became decent. Not because the system is always kind. Just because the paper trail was real and I had the patience to follow it all the way to the end. These days, the house is quieter. Grandma still worries about her mail, but she checks it herself now. Kevin pays restitution on time, from what I hear, and keeps a lower profile. Marla and I are civil, which is more than I expected. The collector account is gone. The fraud report is closed. The bank has not called my grandmother in months. Every once in a while, she still mentions how strange it was that the whole thing started with a phone call and a garage conversation and ended with a stack of receipts and forms. She is not wrong. That is how a lot of real disasters look from the inside. Not dramatic, just preventable. And because I stayed calm long enough to gather the proof, the person who tried to use her name ended up facing the truth instead of me covering for him. That made all the difference.